Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all 389 Bach chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at another harmonization of Freue dich sehr, O meine Seele, which translates to Rejoice greatly, O my soul. This is the second or maybe the third harmonization that we've looked at of this particular melody, so Bach must have been very fond of it. I'm aware that he's harmonized it at least 5 times, so we're going to encounter it again. The fact that we've gone through close to 70 chorales now, and we're only starting to now see duplicates, I think is what's spelling our forecast for the future, because of the fact that Bach reused a lot of melodic material as it was used in and amongst congregations of the Lutheran faith during his time. So I think it's likely that we're going to start seeing the same melody used several times throughout. But that being said, let's hop right into the analysis. So Sharpen the Key Signature. We start on G major, we end on G major. I'm going to hedge my bets and say that we're in the key of G major. We start off with a 1 chord, then we have F sharp, A, D, and A. That is a D major triad in first inversion. That's 5/6. We then have G, G, D, and B. That's another tonic triad in root position. And then we have D, F sharp, D, and A with a 4/3 suspension over the bass. That is a 5 chord again, but this time it's in root position. We then have E, G, D, and G. And I think this D is an accented non-chord tone, and this C sharp is actually the chord tone we're looking for. This is C sharp diminished over E, which would be 7/6 of 5, as C sharp is the leading tone to D, which is our dominant. We then have F sharp, A, D, and F sharp. That's our 5 chord, but this time it's in first inversion with a passing tone in the bass. We then have A, C sharp, and E. That is an A major triad with a passing 7th in the tenor. That is 5 of 5. And then our first cadence, which I neglected to mention, sorry about that, is a half cadence, or at least what I hear is a half cadence in the key of G major, where we cadence on 5. However, if you did hear this as a modulation to D major, I reckon you could have started the modulation as early as beat 4 of the first measure. We could have said that this 5 chord was 1, and then we could have just analyzed everything without the secondary dominance. So this would have just been 7/6. This could have just been a tonic triad in first inversion with 5, and then going to 1. I've talked about at length now the fact that a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, and I'll go ahead and put this here as well, but a perfect authentic cadence in the key of the dominant versus a half cadence, they're both really achieving the same thing. That being said, though, he does go in a deceptive direction following this phrase. Instead of going to G major, as you would expect, he goes to E minor. So E, B, E, and G. That's a 6 chord, which would be a deceptive progression. And then he continues the progression along the way in the direction of G major. We get F sharp, A, D, and A. That's another D major triad in first inversion. We then get G, G, D, and B. That's our tonic triad in root position with a passing 7th in the tenor and this octave leap in the bass. We then get A, E, A, and C. And I would be tempted to call this a 2 chord, but as you know, 2 is often paired with this passing F sharp, so I tend to hear this more as a passing leading tone chord in first inversion. But if you are someone who's inclined to hear it like a minor chord, I will offer that analysis as well. And the reason why I'm sort of sensitive to that diminished sound is because it's usually bridging the gap between 2 tonic triads, or at least the tonic triad is on the tail end of the progression, so B, G, D, and B. You usually see it this way, where 7 goes to 1. We have a passing tone in the bass, and then we have D, G, D, and A. And of course this G is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. This F sharp is what we're looking for, which gives us a D major triad, which is a 5 chord. And then we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So whether or not you heard this as a perfect authentic cadence or a half cadence, it's entirely up to you. I think they're both valid forms of analysis. I just think that it sounds more like a half cadence to me, so that's why I analyzed it. But I think both analyses are accurate. All right, looking ahead, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So I didn't analyze this with any modulations in mind because it just sounded like the key of G major the entire time. So it makes it really convenient for analysis sake. All right, so we have another G major triad with a rotation of the voices at the beginning of the B section, G, D, G, and B, with a passing seventh in the bass. We then have E, E, G, and C. That's a first inversion C major triad, or 4/6. We then have D, A, F sharp, and D. That's our dominant triad, D major in root position. We then have E, E, G, and C sharp. Kind of a deceptive progression going on, but instead of going to E minor, he keeps the E in the bass and goes back to C major again. We then have a passing F sharp in the bass. Now usually what happens here is after a 4 chord, especially when it's bridging the gap between 4 and 1, which is the chord we have on the next beat, G, D, G, and B, we usually get a 7 chord. However, we have the passing bass. We see the 7th scale degree, F sharp, our leading tone, in the bass. However, we don't have the A in the chord. G is still continued here. So if G went up to A and then A continued up to B, we would have our progression, but here we don't quite have it. However, do keep in mind the fact that F sharp is usually seen bridging the gap between 4 and 1, especially 4/6. We then have D, D, F sharp, and A, again continuing this theme of suspending the G into the D major triad, but this is still just a root position 5 chord. And then we go to G major again, but this time it's spelled pretty much the same way as we see it at the beginning of the measure, with the B in the soprano, which is what makes it imperfect authentic, as opposed to perfect authentic. Okay, next cadence is a half cadence, still in the key of G major, but we get C sharp, so we're going to see some secondary dominance moving forward. We also get this interesting G natural, this interesting F natural here, and that I think changes the function of the chord, and I think this is the most interesting chord progression in the entire chorale, and you kind of just glance over it because it just sounds normal for Bach to do, but we get this C major scale fragment, right? G, F natural, E, D, C. So if we see a G major chord, we would be tempted to call it 1, but this F natural kind of makes it feel like 5 of 4, as in major keys you need that dominant 7th to contextualize the tonic, to separate it from its tonic function. So I'm thinking this is 5 of 4, and he's able to articulate that through that passing 7th on the next and. And then we get E, B, G, and D. Now I was tempted to call this an E minor 7 chord, and that this would be some sort of like deceptive progression or something along those lines, but I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and instead we get another version of the D major triad, G major triad, but this time we get the D in the bass. We get D, B, G, and D. So I think what's happening here is that we're actually getting the 5 chord in second inversion, and because it's part of a passing figure, I think that makes sense. So the reason, my line of thinking is the fact that we get C major on the next beat. We get C, C, G, and E, and that's the ultimate trajectory of the 5 of 4 anyways, so I think he just sustains it over a longer period of time. You might have even heard this section in the key of C major, and if that was the case, you could have analyzed it like this: 5, 6, 4, and then cadencing on 1, where you then could have gone back to the key of D major, but I don't think the modulations that are this brief are relatively uncommon. Like I said, it's not unprecedented, but they're mostly uncommon, so I would be wary to analyze it this way unless you had good reason to do so. But we do have a passing tone in the tenor, and then we go from 4 to D, A, F sharp, and D, again with this suspended G over the bass, creating a 4/3 suspension. That's just a 5 chord in root position. And here we go into the cadential progression. We have E, G, G, and C. We have another 4/6 chord, And this is what I'm talking about with the passing 7 chord. F sharp, A, E, and C. He turns that 4 chord into a 7/7 chord in root position. Remember, it's half diminished because F sharp to E is not a diminished 7th, it's a minor 7th. And then we get G, B, D, and B. 4/7/1 is a much more normative progression of the time period. And here's a really cool thing that Bach does as well to emphasize the dominant, which is what he cadences on, right? 5, that's what makes it a half cadence. G, C sharp, E, and B. These passing tones pretty much do the exact same thing that the 4/7/1 progression is doing in the key of G major. This C sharp is 7/4/3 of 5, and 1/7/4/3 of 5 is a roundabout way of saying 4/7/1 in the key of the dominant. So Bach is definitely cognizant of the sound or the harmonic trajectory that he's trying to achieve, and he really succeeds. It's a very beautiful progression. But then again, it kind of straddles the line between, are we in the key of D major or are we in the key of G major? I still continue to hear A as the 2 of the scale, but you might hear it as the dominant. Ultimately, the fact that G major follows immediately afterwards is telling, but I don't know. To me, really both analyses are okay. You could analyze this in the key of D major as 4/7/4/3 5. Or sorry, not 5. My apologies, 1. So moving into the next phrase, we have a very interesting cadence. We have another one of those cadences that Bach does where he cadences on 4. And I'm not 100% certain if it's an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major or if it's some type of plagal. I really don't know what type of terminology we use to describe this because it doesn't sound like we've modulated per se, but saying that G major going to C major doesn't sound like a dominant going to a tonic. That sounds kind of disingenuous. So I'm going to say that we have modulated at this point, just for the sake of staying consistent with my previous analyses that I've done that have encountered cadences like this. But we have a 1 chord here, just a plain old G major in root position. C's been naturalized. We get another G chord here with this delayed 7th, which is a really nice gesture. And then we have A, C, E, and C. I would be tempted to call that a 2 chord, but again, this F sharp is following it, which makes it sound more like 7/6 to me. But again, 2 afterwards. It's 6 of one, half dozen another. 6 dozen of one, half another. That doesn't make sense. But yeah, the reason why I think it sounds like 7/6 because it makes sense that we have it immediately before another 1 chord, B, D, G, and B, which is just a tonic triad in root position, with some passing tones as well. We then get C, E, E, and G. That is a root position C major triad, which is a 4 chord. Notice how it's going down here, so we're not going to see it bridge the gap between any 1 chords or anything. It's going down. It's only really when it's going up when you can get that passing 7 chord. But then we have A, C, F sharp, and A. And the interesting thing is that we're not going to see it bridge the gap on the 8th note because this is our 7 chord. No passing 7th because we have a 7/6 on its own beat. And that goes to 1 in root position. So we have G, D, G, and B. Passing tone in the bass. First inversion G major chord in the on this beat here as the rest of the voices are sustained above it. It goes back to root position on the and of 4, and then we cadence on 4. But like I said, it doesn't sound like it modulated to me, but if you do hear it in the key of C major, this would be 5, 5/6, back to root position, 1. I don't know which way to hear it. I think that both are valid analyses, so I'll offer them both up to you. All in all, my intuition is that he hasn't modulated. That's just how it sounds. The melody doesn't sound like it's in the key of C major by any means. It could be in the key of C major, but it doesn't sound like it to me. Yes, so moving forward, we have G, D, G, and B. There's our tonic triad, passing tone in the soprano. That's just a melodic tone, but it's still passing from a harmonic standpoint. We then have F sharp, D, A, and D. It's a D major triad over F sharp. which is a 5/6 chord. We then have E, G, G, and C. Again, we have 5/6, or a 5 chord going to 4 chord again. And here we have F sharp, A, and C. But interestingly enough, we have this G here. So there is this idea of a passing 7 chord here. But it's not complete entirely because this G is in the mix. But there's this still, and actually I'm going to remove my analysis there. But it is important to bear in mind, like just how we saw, right, where was it? If you've already seen it, you probably have seen it before me. This idea of this movement of a 4 chord, but not seeing the entirety of the chord. I know it's here somewhere. It's okay, I'm dallying too long anyways. But yeah, this idea of the 4 chord wanting to go to 1 and bridging the gap between it with the F sharp, that passing tone, to bridge the third. That would be between the third of the 4 chord and the root of the tonic triad, which happens here. But there's definitely a little bit of an implied 7th going on. Just this G suspended in it is really crunchy because you get this half step between the F sharp and the G. We then have some passing tones in the inner voices. We then have C, D, F sharp, and A, a very beautiful chord. That's D7 over C, which is a 5/4-2 chord. We then have B, D, G, and B. That is a G major triad over B, which is pretty much always where 5/4-2 goes. It usually goes down to a root position, a tonic triad in first inversion. Or sorry, a root position tonic triad in first inversion. That doesn't make sense. A tonic triad in first inversion. We have a passing tone in the bass. We then have D, D, G, and A. So instead of getting a 1/6-4 chord here, we get a 5 chord with a 4/3 suspension over the bass, which seems to be just as common as 1/6-4, to be honest. We have a delayed 7th in passing here before we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of oh, there's no questioning that. I was just in the same sort of muscle mode as I was when I wrote this, my analysis for this cadence, but this is definitely a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. So all in all, actually, for as straightforward as the harmonic analysis was for this chorale, I'd say that it had its moments where there was ambiguity. Half cadences still straddle the line between being perfect authentic cadences in one key or being half cadences in the tonic key. Either way, I think both analyses are fine. It just ultimately depends on how you hear it. It just sometimes a little alarm can go off in my head if I see too many secondary dominants in a chain without seeing a tonic, right? Because if you see a lot of secondary dominants, aren't you just in the key? And the melody sometimes conflicts with that. But like I said, my relationship with tonality at this point is really being challenged, and there are a lot of conflicting factors here, right? We have a melody that's implying one thing and a harmony that's implying something different. So the dichotomy between the the harmony's implications and what the melody was composed to, with the intentions of the melody, they disagree with each other from time to time, and that is hard for me to reconcile with my listening. But I do analyze it, and I offer all of the viewpoints that I do see, and hopefully that you can piece together an analysis that you agree with all of the tidbits that I present to you. But that being said, that's today's analysis, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching and continuing to support the channel. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis. I hope to see you there. I hope you take care.